Once there was an ambitious young businessman, and he was from a large city. And this businessman, he had had a lot of success in what he did. But all of that came with a price. You see, he was a workaholic. And spending all of his time on work, he lost his family, and eventually he lost his joy for work. And he began to really burn out in all that he was doing. And his company he worked for, they didn't want to give up on him because he was young. So instead, they decided that he needed a break. And they sent him away on a 2-month vacation, really just to reset, to a tropical island resort. And while the man's there, he's trying to relax, and obviously he's so driven he's not relaxing too well, and he gets bored. So he begins to walk every day. And as he walks down the shore, one day he walked past where the resort was, and he found himself on a secluded little beautiful beach, really. And the only other person that was on that beach was this local man. And each day then, day after day, the businessman, he would walk down to this beach. And he began to watch this local man and what he'd be doing, because most days he would kind of go out fishing on his boat, and he would take people out fishing, and he would come back in with fish, and it was neat to see him enjoying himself. But then there were other days where he would just be playing on the beach with his family, and still there were other days where he would simply nap on a chair at the water's edge under a shade. And it began to trouble this businessman, because he said, this guy's a young guy like me, yet he's really missing out, and he's not making the most of what he could be doing. So one day he decides he's going to talk to this man, and he approaches this local, and he says, hey, I think I can help you here. And the local man really didn't know what he was talking about, didn't want to hear anything, but he thought he'd at least, hear this man out. Hear what he had to say. So this entrepreneur, this young businessman said, I've been watching you every day, and I can see that while you're a good fisherman, you don't make good use of your time. And I can help with that. You see, if you just got more serious and with some hard work, you could really grow a fishing business out of what you do to be very successful. And the local man responded, well, why would I want to do that? And a little bewildered, the businessman said, well, so you can be happy, of course. You see, if you worked really hard and you advertised down at the resort, you'd get more business. And if you put in enough time and effort, one day you could have a fleet of boats working from this beach. And the man looked at him and said, well, why would I do that? Confused, the businessman looked and said, well, so you could grow big and make more money, right? And the local man said, why do I need that? And now the businessman, he's getting very frustrated by this local yokel guy, right, who isn't appreciating his valuable business advice here. And he blurts out to the guy, what do you mean? Why do you need that? You need that because you want to make more money so that one day you're able to retire early and maybe enjoy the rest of your days fishing and relaxing at some tropical beach somewhere. And to this, a local man looked around and he said, nah, thanks, I'm good. And this little story really tells us something important. That sometimes, we can spend all of our time and effort working to get what is already right in front of us. And that's a little bit about what Solomon's going to talk about as we continue our journey through Ecclesiastes today. So if you're in chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes, remember last week we introduced this book and we looked at the overall theme of Ecclesiastes, which is that we learned a life lived into and for ourselves is ultimately meaningless. Well, today, Solomon starts to put meat on that bone. He starts to give some specific examples of how he did this himself, how he searched this. And one of the reasons I love Ecclesiastes is because in a lot of ways we can learn from Solomon's mistakes before we have to face them. And so we can learn from Solomon today in some of this futility of seeking satisfaction. And our passage this morning looks at two areas where Solomon tries to find satisfaction in his life, one through wisdom and the other through seeking pleasure. So here's what it says, and I want to read to you the rest of chapter 1 and then some of chapter 2 this morning, as it all kind of relates to this subject of satisfaction and these ways. So in verse 12, Solomon says, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is but a striving after the wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. So I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what is good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it. And behold, all was vanity and a striving after the wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who comes after kings? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that there is no more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceived that the same events happen to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this is also vanity, or meaningless. For of the wise as of the fool there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is vanity and a striving after the wind. I hated all my toil, in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he's wise or a fool? Yet he will be the master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This is also vanity. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun. because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This is also vanity. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat and who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases God, he has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the busyness of gathering and collecting, only to give it to one who pleases God. This is vanity and striving after the wind. All right. Well, there's a lot here, isn't it? And as we look at this, and sometimes when we look at Ecclesiastes, we say, man, this is just getting further and further dark, isn't it? It's just getting a little depressing. But as we saw last week, there's hope in all of this. And there's hope in this despair. And this morning, Solomon, the teacher, the preacher, he recounts this exhausting and futile effort that he's putting into life to find satisfaction in his life for himself, only to find that in the end, it's lacking, and all that he's really searching for is already available to him in God. And this passage, then, it looks at two specific areas through which Solomon seeks satisfaction. And I think these areas are important because we see them happening in our world today. In fact, these are probably two of the top areas we see in our society, and we can even see in our life, where we can put our own effort into things rather than trusting God and finding it in Him. And those areas are in gaining wisdom and also by seeking pleasure. So, here's what Solomon's talking about here then, in a nutshell. And the passage does a great job of explaining it, so we're not going to go through and pick apart every verse, but rather we're going to put together some of these themes that he's talking about. And first he begins talking about wisdom. And more specifically, he first talks about his search for wisdom by trying to gain human understanding and knowledge about the purpose of things or how life works. Right? Look at verse 13. He says he wants to seek out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. I want to know the purpose and the meaning of life. I want to know how everything works. I want to know about everything. And again, this isn't a sinful approach or desire, but when we try to do it as a sense of fulfilling ourselves and a means to an end, it's going to end with us being miserable. Because this doesn't satisfy us, just knowing things and knowing how things. In fact, he remarks in verse 13 that it's an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. And what he means by this is it's unhappy or unsatisfying in the point that it's this. Because if we're going to say, I want to know about everything, we're never going to know about anything. And we're always going to find things that we need to know about or we can learn about. If you've ever been there, right? Sometimes the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know. And that's what he's kind of talking about. The more I keep learning about things, the more I'm realizing I have to learn. And it's never going to end. And then you look at verse 14. So he says, it's never going to end and it's unhappy. It's like trying to catch the wind. Have you ever tried to catch the wind? Or chase down the wind? We can't do that, can we? There's always more to know. And even in those things we can know, there's things that we can't explain or make sense of. There's things that happen in our world and we're like, why does this happen? Why does something good happen to somebody that's good or that's bad? And why does something bad happen to somebody that's good? And why did one person get sick and the person right next to them not get sick? Why are mosquitoes even a thing, right? We can look at all these things and we're just like, I don't know why. I don't know that there's an answer. that I can grasp hold of and say, yes, I figured it all out. But we see this in our world, don't we? Somebody wants to figure everything out. And we get into this trap of thinking, I'll finally be satisfied in life if I can figure everything out. We see it when we witness about the gospel, don't we? Share the gospel with people. Sometimes people say, well, I still can't believe in Jesus because I still can't make sense of this. And there's some things about salvation and Jesus and his word and God's word that, yeah, we will never fully be able to reconcile. It's a mystery how it works because it doesn't work by human logic, because God did it. And we'll never be able to 100% figure it all out. And some people say, I can't wait to get to heaven because I'm going to ask God all the answers to questions I've always wanted to know. And I'm like, that's great, we can ask God that, but he doesn't have to tell us. You know why? Because he's the one who knows all. And we never will. And Solomon's coming to this realization that I'm never going to know it all, and yet I'm putting all this work into this in wisdom. So let me go another angle of wisdom. And then in verse 17, he talks about, he applies his mind to know wisdom and madness and folly. And what he's talking about with this is, all right, so now instead of just knowing about everything, I just want to know how to be a good person. I want to know about morality and what makes a person good and what are bad things to do. And I want to know the difference between those things and how to do that. And unfortunately, he comes to the same conclusion. This also is folly. In fact, in much knowledge comes much sorrow. It's frustrating. Why is it frustrating? Because you start to look at that and you say, all right, so if this is good and this is bad, how come sometimes people say, well, this is good at this time, but it's bad at this time? And sometimes you say, all right, well, if somebody does what's good, then they'll get what's good. And if somebody does bad, they'll get what's bad. And then we say that doesn't work like that. And even to try to always be good, then we sometimes fail. And we don't do what we say is good. And it just leads to frustration. And Solomon's starting to experience this. And I don't know if you've ever experienced that. And you say, I just am tired of this because it seems to be just trying to be good in life doesn't seem to get me anywhere. Yet we look around us in our world, and what do people want to do? Well, I just want to be good. You know, if God were to say to you, you know, why should I let you into my heaven? What's the answer many people give? Well, I'm a good person. I do good. Well, who determines what is good? Well, if we do it from a human level, it's just the loudest voice, or it's the crowd that says it, or whatever. And Solomon's like, this is getting more and more difficult. And he says, because it's not always consistent. And then he comes to a realization in chapter 2. In fact, in chapter 2:15, he brings back up wisdom, and he says that, yeah, being wise is better than being a fool. You know, because wise people know things and fools don't know things. So it kind of is important to be wise, but yet I look around me and the same events happen to people whether they're wise or they're foolish. Sometimes wise people have things happen to them that you would think only would happen to a fool. And sometimes a fool falls into something good, and you're like, how did that happen? He says, and ultimately I look around, and whether you're wise or a fool, you end up the same place. You die. And he's starting to say, maybe that saying ignorance is bliss could be a good thing. And here I've been wasting all my time trying to be wise. When I see people walking around being a fool, they end up just like me. In the end, what does it really gain me? So he says, maybe wisdom isn't the way. So then he says, well, wisdom didn't get me there. Maybe pleasure will. Maybe I could give myself everything I desire. So as we look at the beginning of chapter 2, he says, I'm going to give up on my mind and turn to my desires and physical pleasure. And he says, come now, I will test you with pleasure. And what he's doing, he's talking about his satisfaction. He says, I will see if pleasure works, if pleasure fills me, because wisdom really didn't fill me. And so he tries to fill himself with every kind of pleasure. But he already says right in the beginning, I'm going to see if I can do this. But you know what I already found out? I'll give you the end. it's vanity. Gets me nowhere. And he says, even in, I say in laughter, it's mad. And of pleasure, what use is it? And what he's saying by that is we're going to make ourselves miserable. And we're going to be sitting there laughing and saying, yeah, isn't this fun? But really, we're miserable because we're stuck in that. And we're like, what a rut I'm stuck in. What use is all of this? Where is it getting me? And then he kind of recounts how he's given himself to his desires and what he's desired to try to fill himself with. And first he says in verse 4, he says, I'm going to please myself through great works or through my achievements, what I can achieve, what I can do. That's going to finally make me feel complete. So he says, I got houses and I got vineyards, I got gardens, parks, forests, and all of these great cutting-edge things. And isn't it awesome? As we'll find, no, it's not. And then he says, well, then I'm going to accumulate stuff. I'm going to get resources. So he starts to accumulate things that will make his life easier and make him happy. So he gets slaves that can wait on him hand and foot, and then they even grow, and he has flocks and herds more than anybody else around him. He says, look at everything I have, and silver and gold, and kings are bringing him money, and taxes are coming his way, and he says, look at all my wealth and all my resources. Maybe this will make me complete and satisfied. And then he says, and then I gave myself, or I started to give myself to the pleasure of affirmation. And I brought people into my life who would just make me feel good about myself. Right? He says, I gathered singers, both men and women. These singers would sit around all day and say, how great is Solomon? He's such a great guy. You got it going. They were like this little hollaback crowd, just saying, yeah, you go. And you got this. So he had that kind of ringing in his ears. And then he says, yeah, but I need to feel like a real man. And I want to feel adored. So then he gave himself to concubines and be giving himself to other women so that he could feel like he is something. And he says, all of these things, whatever I've wanted, I've gotten. And I've gotten more than anybody else has ever had. And on top of that, I still have my wisdom that I achieved. And I've done all of this and more. And I've just brought it all together. Have you ever been there? Have you ever tried to say, I'm going to make myself happy if I just have this? If I could just get this, then it would be great. If I could just have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, then my life would shape up. If I had that car, if I had that fishing reel. And we look at all of these things, right? Or if I can just be recognized by others as doing a great job, then I'd be complete. And we're looking at everything outside and what the world says is success. And we start to desire these things. But you know what Solomon kind of talks about that? He says that's a reward for my toil, right? You work to get what you desire, and you desire more. So then you have to work more. And that's the reward for all your work, is you get to just get more stuff and when you get more stuff, you'll realize you don't have enough stuff, so you'll want more stuff. And it just keeps growing and growing and growing because it never satisfies. And the more you try to accumulate and the more you try to find that pleasure, we realize, like Solomon realizes, this pursuit of his own pleasure is meaningless, right? It's worthless. He says in verse 18, and in the end, he says, here's the biggest deal about it. I brought all this together. You can't take it with you. Just like with wisdom, it ends with you. In fact, the search for wisdom and pleasure are both endless pursuits, bringing that which doesn't satisfy and does not last. Do you see it here? Do you see what he's talking about here? So to all of this, in verse 24 then, Solomon comes to a couple conclusions. And the first conclusion is, so if this is the case and I've done all this, what does anything matter anymore? Basically, I might as well just eat, drink, and be merry, because I'm going to die. And there's no purpose to any of it. And there's no value in any of it. And that's what he says, right? There's nothing better for a person than he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. And he says, this also I saw is from the hand of God. He says, now I'm starting to see that maybe God has brought me to this place so that I see all those things I seek are in him. Because of verse 25, he says, for apart from him, who can eat and who can have enjoyment? You see, satisfaction apart from God is a wasted effort, Solomon concludes. It's wasted effort, it's wasted time, and it's wasted desires. You know, seeking these desires of Solomon, they weren't the issue where he was going wrong. It wasn't necessarily his desires. Again, some of the things he desired were good, and they were things that God created. Even intimacy that he craved, God created, but God created wisdom and knowledge. He created his creation for us to enjoy and to work in. He created us things that would help us be able to live better. And God created all this, so it's not necessarily the things themselves that were bad. It was in that Solomon was trying to find fulfillment in those things in his own efforts, rather than finding them in God and seeing them through God's eyes. So he starts to put all this together, and he says, man, all of these things that I'm trying to experience, I'm trying to seek in myself rather than in God. And then in verse 26, he comes to another great conclusion, and that is true satisfaction, which is enjoyment and contentment, is found only through and only in God. God has it for us. God has it waiting for us. What Solomon had been desperately striving to and failing to accomplish was already there in God. All of this satisfaction, all of this meaning, all of this purpose, and these needs that he was created with that he's trying to fill is already available, and it's waiting there in the hand of God and saying, I have it for you. In other words, this whole passage leads to this conclusion. Why strive for satisfaction that will never be realized or enjoyed in ourselves when it's fully and freely given now through God? Did you get that? Why should we strive for satisfaction that will never be realized or enjoyed in ourselves when it's already there for us? It's already freely given right now through God. It's like our opening story that we just that I told. You know, sometimes we can spend all of our time working to get what is already right in front of us. And Solomon said, I went down this road only to realize that right here it always was. You see, true satisfaction is not earned through our work and effort. True satisfaction is found only one place, in God and God alone. And it's given by him. You know, author Phil Ryken has said this about this subject, that once we learn how to find our satisfaction in God himself, then all his gifts become the best and truest pleasures. Do you get that? Once we find that satisfaction is in God, then you know what we find? That everything he gives us, we'll find pleasure in. And we'll see that it was given to us to be satisfied in all that he gives us so that we can glorify him. Once we receive our satisfaction from God, we can truly understand and enjoy God and the life he gives us. You see, a lot of times we walk around and we're very dissatisfied. Even believers are dissatisfied. We're dissatisfied in God because he hasn't given us what we think we should have, or he hasn't given us what somebody else has. Have you ever felt dissatisfied with God? And you're saying, God, this isn't fair. You know, I don't know why this happened. And God says, but I gave you what I'm giving you so that it will fill you and so that you can be fully satisfied in that. But I guess the question is, at the end of the day, in looking at all of this information, is how do we find this, or how do we receive our satisfaction in God? How do we get to that point where we get off of ourselves and see it in God? Well, as we close this morning, I'd like to offer 3 important attitudes that we need, or that need to be present in us, that enable us and enable this satisfaction in our lives. And the first is through the attitude of humility. You want to be satisfied in God? Then we need to be humble in ourselves. What do you see from Solomon here when he talks about knowledge and wisdom? What does he say? He says, I want to know it all. And I do. But yet I find that I still need to learn more. But I want to know everything about everything. Do you know where satisfaction in God begins? It begins with us realizing we can never know it all, but we can know the one who knows it all. And when we realize that we're not the end-all, be-all, we can be great at what we do, but there's going to be somebody come along that's better. We can find something and discover something and say, this is the greatest thing ever, and somebody will discover something just as good. And Solomon kind of talks about that nothing's new, right, under the sun, what he talked about last year. You see, God satisfies our desire, this desire for wisdom and knowing, and he satisfies it when we humble ourselves and said, all right, God, I want to seek you and your wisdom. And you know, an amazing thing that happens with that? God has all that wisdom. And when we can humble ourselves, instead of looking to ourselves and what we can build, we start to look to him and we say, oh, God knows this. In fact, God gives me wisdom in his word on these things. And even better than that, if I want to know what's good and what's right to do in my life, he gives us that too, because guess what? Paul says, but to those who are called, both Jew and Greek, Christ is the power of God and he's the wisdom of God. We can look to Jesus because when we look at him, we see what's important. We see the wisdom of God, how he makes things work, this mystery, how he can give us grace, that which we don't earn or deserve, but yet he freely gives it, how he can love us before we even love him, how he can do for us what we could never hope to do for ourselves, how he's the one who's wronged, yet he comes to reconcile it and reconcile us to himself. You see, that's the wisdom of God. But that only comes through humility and saying, I can't figure all this out, but yet I know one who does. And I'm going to seek him. In fact, that's how we come around to this wisdom, is we do this through our second attitude, and that's through trust. We need to humble ourselves, and we also need to have the attitude of trust, that I'm willing to trust that God knows best. God knows what's right, and God is going to give me what's best for me right where I am, right here and now. And it's a matter of trusting. That's what satisfaction is all about, isn't it? It's not always looking at the grass is always greener. It's not always saying, this is what I want or this is what I hope to be. And God, why haven't you done that? It's saying, God, where have you put me right now? And wow, look what you've placed before me. And look what you've shown me to do. I have plenty to do right here and now. Sometimes we say, I want to know the will of God. All right, well, Jesus says, here's the will of God, to love him with all your heart, mind, and soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And everything else falls under that. Are you doing that yet? Because God puts that before us, and that's his wisdom. And that's what's right, and that's what's good, and that's what he is eternal for us to be doing. And sometimes we don't trust that, and we don't trust that he gives us the way to go. Again, we're to trust in the Lord with all our heart, right? Tom Horton's favorite verse, right? You never forget it. And we lean not into our own understanding. In all our ways, we acknowledge him, right? We trust him. and he's going to make our path straight. He's going to show us the way to go. In fact, he does that through Jesus, doesn't he? He gives us a great example to follow. If we're supposed to know how to act in our world and how to do things in our world, we can look to the life of Jesus. Peter says this, "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so you might follow in his steps." We might live like Jesus lived. Well, how did Jesus live? Well, he committed no sin. Neither was deceit found in his mouth. He wasn't trying to get away with stuff. When he was reviled, he didn't revile in return. He wasn't quick-tempered. He wasn't trying to get somebody. When he suffered, he didn't threaten, but he continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. So no matter how he was treated in the world, he knew that God was in control. And he says, all right, God, you're in control. He himself bore our sins in his body on a tree that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds we have been healed. You know what Jesus does? He offers grace and mercy, which can transform our lives. And he says, share that. You want to share wisdom? You want to share life? You want to share satisfaction? I'm giving you. Trust that it's right and it's good. Do we trust that? You know, sometimes we might not always understand why God leads us in a certain situation, or why it may seem easier to follow the crowd sometimes, you know, where at work everybody's taking shortcuts, or when we're with our friends, everybody's kind of taking a softer stance on sin. And if we want to kind of fit in, we can do. When we don't understand why God would put us in a situation, well, it's because he wants us to trust that his way is always best. And an amazing thing happens when we trust him and we follow him, that his truth will always prevail. And even those situations where we say, oh, everybody's going to hate me, but they're going to get to hear his truth. And they're going to come to that. I just had that this week with a group of guys that I hang with, and they're all younger, and they're not saved, and they all have different viewpoints and different things. And I just decided to speak up, and I shared God's truth with them. And you know what? They're like, hey, never heard that before. I'm going to try that. I'm going to check this out further. And all of a sudden you're just like, wow, why didn't I speak up sooner? Why didn't I follow sooner? And then finally, this satisfaction of God as we begin to trust him, do you know where it really blossoms? Through the attitude of worship. Because we show our satisfaction and we find greater satisfaction in God when we see that everything is God's and we get to glorify him in everything that he gives us. Every situation we find ourselves in, every place that we go, everything that God gives us is an opportunity for us to worship him in. Sometimes we say, well, yeah, I got to worship God, so I got to go to church. Yeah, we worship God here at church. We do. But do you worship him at your job? Do you worship him when you're out doing your hobby, watching the Eagles game? Are you finding that as an opportunity to worship him, to bring him glory and say, thank you, God, for this? Rather than always just having an attitude of, all right, God, well, I have this, but then I have that, so you better give me more so that I can find something good. Rather than us seeing everything that God has, that he's given us and placed before us, as an opportunity to point to him and his greatness. And we worship when we view people and situations through God's eyes and through his perspective, rather than saying, well, this isn't good. No, this is a great opportunity where we can lift God up. We had that with Eileen, right? Going through her cancer. And as she goes through the cancer, she says, what a great opportunity this is to share Jesus with all these people. Isn't that awesome? Everybody else saying, what are you, nuts? She says, why? Because it's the attitude of worship. It's saying, this isn't a negative, it's an opportunity that God's given me to worship him. And God helps us, and we see him as our provision and meeting our needs. And we see even our place of work doesn't have to be a slog. It gets to be a place where we get to demonstrate and walk in the gifts he's given us and the abilities and the passions he's given us. And we get to go to work, not just have to. But it gets to be an opportunity where we can show him through us, who he's made us to be. And that's what Paul gets at in Romans, where he says, you know, I appeal to you therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Then he says, don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Have God show you what's great about this, instead of listening to everybody else and saying what you have isn't enough. You need more, or you need this, or you need that, and that's going to complete you. Now listen to God and say, all right, God, you've given me this, and if you could take me out of this, I trust that you could. But because you don't, you have me here to praise you and for your glory. And he says that by the testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect, as we live that out. You know, how would your satisfaction at home or at work this week or at school, going to school, be if you viewed all of that as an opportunity to worship God, to glorify God? How would that change when you're doing your homework this week? Or having to go to yet another meeting? You see, the attitude of worship changes everything. So again, instead of striving for satisfaction in what we think or desire, or what others are telling us is good to desire, we get to find it in God. And we get to find our pleasure in God, who gives it to us, so we don't have to strive and never get it. He says it's available here, and it's available in me. Let's pray.